TikTok is arguably the worst consumer product in human history. TikTok is sucking up more human attention than any other company ever has. And what does it return? A negative experience on average. The people who use it don't even like it.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
There is a book that has taken the world by storm. You've probably heard all about it already. Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation. Haidt has made media appearances everywhere, from Oprah to Joe Rogan to The Daily Show to Bill Maher, Christiane Amanpour, 60 Minutes, you name it.
Haidt is the Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at NYU. And he lays out a case in which social media is the cause of the skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression, which have gone up at a dramatic clip. Some 57% of female high school students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in 2021, up from 36% a decade ago, according to a biannual survey released last year by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Among teenage boys, feelings of hopelessness rose from 21% to 29%, so it's less pronounced but is still present.
Haidt is obviously not alone in blaming social media. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General issued an advisory, a format reserved for public health issues that demand the nation's immediate attention.
The U.S. Surgeon General is calling on Congress to require a warning label on all social media platforms.
Nearly every teenager in America uses social media, the report read, and yet we do not have enough evidence to conclude that it's sufficiently safe for them. Haidt, for his part, proposes 4 solutions. No social media below the age of 16, no smartphones, only flip phones before 14, phone-free schools, and more play for children in the real world.
Haidt also makes a broader argument. He doesn't claim that social media is the only problem. He argues that we don't protect our children enough when they are online, but we protect them too much offline. We let them play on their phones. We don't let them play outside.
There are, of course, aspects of this that make Haidt an obvious guest for capitalism. If Haidt is right, then social media is an obvious capitalism. If something that's terrible for us is nonetheless generating stupendous profits, we have to, at a minimum, examine it closely.
His book is also about how adolescents learn and what could be more core to not just the economic function in society, but the function of society. If we have gotten that wrong, then we're getting everything wrong. In that case, what is the optimal educational system? Is there a case for more government intervention to fix all the mistakes the parent makes, or that companies encourage us to make? What is the trade-off between the transmission of family values and the virtue of independence and free will?
So here's Jonathan Haidt to answer all of our questions and then some. I'm instinctively inclined to agree with your argument. I have a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old daughters. It makes sense to me that a girl looking at unrealistic images on Instagram is going to become depressed and anxious. But your book is met with a remarkable degree of controversy. As the Wall Street Journal put it in a headline, managing the blowback has become a full-time job. Why do you think this is the case? Why does this topic elicit so much rancor?
Well, no, but that's the funny thing, is that headline was bizarre.
Oh.
It's not a full-time job. There's almost no blowback. It's astonishing. There are about 6 researchers who think I'm wrong, and they publish articles saying the correlations are tiny and there's no evidence of causation. Yeah, we're doing cherry picking, but we're the only ones who pick all the cherries. We pick every single cherry. We lay them out on a blanket with categorizations. We say, here are all the correlational studies. And look, they almost all show a correlation. Here are all the longitudinal studies. And look, they suggest a forward causation from social media to mental health problems. Some suggest reverse, but most suggest that direction. And here are the experiments. This is what's so frustrating. We're the only ones who have said, here are all the experiments. Take a look. It's a totally normal academic debate. It's not rancorous. We're not yelling and screaming. We're not insulting each other. It takes a couple hours a week. So journalists want to make it seem like there's this big thing. But wherever I go, people say what you just did. parents and administrators and legislators and teachers saying, yes, finally, we knew this was messing up the kids. Finally, we have a diagnosis and we have a way forward. And the other amazing thing, I can't find anyone from Gen Z who disagrees with me. Gen Z sees, they're not in denial. They really see this is messing them up.
Why do you think people want it to be a debate?
Well, from what I've heard, because I keep getting asked about a couple of studies by researchers at Oxford. And I was like, why is everyone citing this one study? One of the journalists told me that Meta has been sending it around. Meta has a couple of favorite researchers, and it's been sending around their studies they're trying to amplify the other side. And one reason that I get more and more confident that I'm right, every time a meta-analysis comes out or some paper is said to show that I'm wrong, you look into it and you see they didn't look at girls in social media. They just lumped everything together and they didn't find anything. I will go into their data and say, but look, if you look at what's happening to girls from social media, you always find it. I've been at this now intensely since 2019, and I haven't yet found anything that really, I think, strongly contradicts what I'm saying.
Let me try the best piece of evidence against you that I saw. So a paper by Janet Curry, who is claiming that the classification of problems, especially with girls, changed around 2010, 2012. So how do you interpret your result in light of this criticism?
Well, first of all, you got to tell me, is that one about changing standards because of Obamacare or insurance guidance? Is that in the United States?
Yes, in the United States, yeah.
So first of all, why did the same thing then happen in Canada and the UK and Australia and New Zealand and the Nordic? Why did the same thing happen? Were they all basically saying, hey, we should do what they're doing in the United States? It doesn't make any sense. If this was just a US thing, then I'd be very sympathetic to that. Because, okay, look, there are 2 points of skepticism. The extreme skeptics, some people are so skeptical, they say there's no problem. It's just changing diagnostic criteria. Oh, the government changed something, so it looks like there's a teen mental health crisis, but there isn't. And then the second one is, okay, there's something going wrong, but what caused it? Is it social media and smartphones? And my argument is that it's the loss of the play-based childhood being replaced by the phone-based childhood. So my story is not a one-factor story. I used to say it was a tragedy in 2 acts, but it's actually a tragedy in 3 acts. Act 1 is we lose trust in each other and we lose community. And this is all the stuff Robert Putnam wrote about, in Bowling Alone. Act 2, because we lose trust in each other, we lose community, we therefore crack down on the play-based child. We say, no more of that. It's too dangerous. You're going to stay inside all the time. Always be supervised by an adult. As we're doing that, this fabulous new internet comes in. So the kids are like, oh, cool. Okay, I'll just do video games, for the boys especially. I reminisce about adventures with my best friend from childhood, and I wonder what my son's generation is going to reminisce about when they're 60 years old. Do you remember Fortnite game number 27,362? When we were fighting off those guys from Brazil, and you were hiding behind the refrigerator, and we had a shoot. No, I don't remember that game. There aren't really adventures. There's entertainment, but they're not really adventures. And so this is Act 3, is the arrival of the phone-based childhood. But let's focus now on the first skeptical argument, which is the kids are okay. It was just changing diagnostic criteria. Really? So that means that everyone is wrong. When you interview with surveys done of college presidents, what is your top concern? For almost every college president, one of the top 2 or 3 was mental health. They're just confusing correlation for causation. There's nothing going on. The psychiatrist, the psychologist, the teachers, everyone is wrong. All the parents. I have not yet met a parent who says, oh, no, the kids are fine. We need skeptics. We need devil's advocates. I've written a lot about this in The Coddling of the American Mind, in The Righteous Mind. The whole point of Heterodox Academy is we can't all be on the same side in the social sciences. We have to have some political diversity. So I welcome the skeptics. But for those who are still saying in 2024 that there's nothing going on, that mental health is fine, that it's just an illusion based on changing government standards, I don't think that's credible. What do you think, Luigi?
I agree with you, but I have to play the devil's advocate.
Please give me all the criticisms you can find.
So I have a slightly different devil's advocate argument. Phone-based technology is probably not going away unless we get a chip in our heads that we have to turn on and off. And I think about this through the lens of experience, because I grew up without a TV set in the home. My parents didn't believe in it. I have never watched TV. It didn't click for me at all. I still don't watch it to this day, which leaves me horribly out of it in culture conversations about childhood culture, which is another issue. But my sister, when she got to college, my sister would argue, I think, that she spent far too much time watching TV, at least initially, because she had no ability to manage it, no ability to say no to it. And so doesn't that argue for some teaching kids how to manage this rather than saying no entirely? And doesn't it also argue that different children need different things?
Yes, that argument makes sense for some temptations, but this isn't a temptation in the same way. This is a social addiction. That is, why is everyone on it at age 12? Because everyone else is on it. That's the reason. There was a great study that came out. They surveyed college students about how much would we have to pay you to not use whichever platform you use. And I think the average answer was something like $50. To get off for a month, you'd have to pay me a certain amount of money. And then they said, suppose everybody got off. Now, how much would we have to pay you to get off? And the answer is negative $50 or some number. Oh, everyone? Oh, I would love that. I would love to get everyone off. TikTok is arguably the worst consumer product in human history because TikTok is sucking up more human attention than anything ever has. I mean, obviously, all of television, sure. But TikTok is sucking up more human attention than any other company ever has. And what does it return? A negative experience on average. The people who use it don't even like it. But because it's a collective action problem, it's a social trap, they have to be on it because the disutility of being the only one not on it is worse than the disutility of spending 5 hours a day on it. So that, I think, is a good reason from an economics point of view to say, not that we should ban it for that reason, but something is really wrong with the market if one of the most used consumer products in the country is harming not its customers, it's harming its users for the benefit of its customers, which are, of course, the advertisers. Something is really wrong. And I would actually love to know what you guys think about the role of regulation when you have harms like this.
I think that this is incredibly important in terms of regulation because we know the US government has introduced regulation for advertising cigarettes to teenagers. We know that advertisers really trying to enter early in the game because they want to shape the view. So maybe we should have a general ban on advertising in any program targeted to people below 16 or 18.
I think that's a good idea. I wrote the book as an American, assuming that I will never get any help from Congress because we don't have a functioning Congress in this country. On this one issue, they actually agree. This is the one bipartisan issue because most legislators are in their 40s and 50s. Well, actually nowadays 70s, but they almost all have children. Almost all legislators have children or grandchildren. So they all see it. So actually, there is a reasonable chance that the Congress will pass KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act. I'm really hopeful they'll do that. That would just make, if you're going to spend 10 hours a day online, at least this makes it less harmful. The big thing that we really need Congress for is age verification. The way Congress wrote the law, COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, in 1998, I think it was, something around there. The question wasn't at what age is social media safe, because there was no social media. It was like, at what age can AOL take personal information from a child and use that? At what age? At what age can a kid agree to that without their parents' knowledge or permission? Senator Markey, he was then Congressman Markey, said 16. 16 seems like a reasonable age at which kids can do this. And then various lobbyists for the tech industry, they pushed it down to 13 with zero enforcement. The way the law is written, as long as Meta doesn't know that you're under 13, they're fine. You can be 3. And as long as you're old enough to lie about your age, you're on, and Meta has no responsibility. Oh, just to make sure they have no responsibility, how about we pass a special law? Let's call it Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Let's pass a special law so that the biggest, most powerful companies in the world who own our children's childhood and are directing our children off a cliff, how about if we give them a special protection that nobody can sue them? We cannot sue them for what they do to our kids. How about that? So that's what Congress did to us in the 90s. They set up the internet in a way that basically made it inevitable. Now, the early internet was amazing, utopian, open. There was no way to make money on it. Internet, Web 1, you couldn't do transactions. It was just you put up stuff and other people find you. I mean, it was amazing. But then you get Web 2, you get the profit motive much more, you get the concentration under a few for-profit companies. That's when everything goes to hell. The U.S. Congress created this problem. The U.S. Congress seems incapable of solving it. KOSA would help, but it's not going to be a game changer the way age verification would. But you know what? We're not the only country in the world. And as Meta often points out, the U.S. is not, it's their biggest market, I think, but it's only a small percentage. It's not most of their markets overseas. Meta has a lot less power in Britain than they do in America. Britain is acting. They've passed 2 major laws, the Age-Appropriate Design Code and the Online Harms Act, which have complicated rollout because they're going to force some kinds of age verification. So they're doing it right, I think, because it wasn't just like, we're going to write all the details. No, it was like, we're going to direct Ofcom, the regulator, we're going to direct them for what they need to achieve. And now over a period of years, we're going to work out the details. So Britain is acting. I just glanced at what Macron has proposed. So Macron, some French, they had a commission of experts to make recommendations. They're pushing for an age of 18 for most social media, and they mean profit-driven social media. The French are acting, the EU is acting, Australia is acting. If those 4 jurisdictions pass serious regulations, it's going to go global because the companies don't want to have different Instagram in different countries.
But Section 230 was written at a time where Facebook was not even in the mind of Zuckerberg. So what went wrong? Why people did not update and change the liability of Section 230 as the internet changed?
For 2 reasons, I think. The obvious one is that Meta and the other companies and Google and all of them spend huge amounts of money. They have, more lobbyists in Washington than many other, large industries combined. So these are the richest companies on earth, and they have an awful lot of power to influence our legislature, which is corruptible in the sense that they're all competing for money. The other part, I believe, is that the scientific evidence has not been clear. And I think that's because a few highly publicized articles claimed that there was no evidence. Now, I'm in a debate with them. I think the evidence is actually pretty strong. But, as with tobacco and as with global warming, if there's ambiguity, if we're not sure that this is causing harm to our kids, well, it's kind of hard to push through a really big draconian law that's going to curtail some people's access. Because ideally, if Meta did age verification, anybody who wants to sign up for an Instagram account, they would have to click a button and they'd have to go through a process. Now, I think that we can get the process down to 5 or 10 seconds, but it will take an extra 5 or 10 seconds for them to age verify. But if the research isn't crystal clear, then there's a lot of opposition to doing that. I'm hoping to show, what the research is in. The correlational studies, the experimental studies, the quasi-experimental studies, the testimony of the kids, the testimony of the parents, the experience around the world. I don't know if you saw it just the other day. There's an article in the New York Times, a remote Amazonian tribe. They didn't have electricity until recently. They suddenly got Starlink. They got Elon Musk's internet. And what happens? Within 9 months ago, they got it. And they say the kids are watching porn, everyone's on their device, everyone's ignoring everybody. All this crazy, terrible stuff is happening within 9 months. So, I think now the evidence is in, and now it's a lot easier to justify. And I do think we are seeing state legislatures are acting.
So it almost seems to me that the other part of your argument might be the harder one to fix, the safetyism. It is a feature of our increasingly unequal society where parents feel in order to keep up that they have to stuff every moment of their children's time with educational activity. Because if your children don't emerge at the very top of the pinnacle, then, oh my goodness, they're going to be left behind. And so it seems to me that's all caught up in these broader social issues that seem to me very, very hard to fix.
So there's 2 separate things going on. One is the way our economy changed to become more competitive, and that might explain why some of these problems are worse in the Anglo countries. So in America and Britain, it seems to be worse than in continental Europe, the mental health problems. But the other one, which I think is the bigger problem, is that we have lost trust in each other to such an extent that we're afraid to let our kids out. The move from 3 television networks and all very civil to cable TV with round-the-clock news coverage. When I was writing The Coddling, I did some research on kidnapping. According to the FBI, there's something on the order of 100 true kidnappings a year in this country. True kidnapping is by a stranger. Most kidnappings are by the non-custodial parent. It's a family dispute. But a true kidnapping, you send your kid out for ice cream and she's taken away in a white van. That's like 100, 150 times, something in there. And a quarter of them are never even reported, because they're kids who don't really have parents. They're no one's looking out for them. Cable TV put those few cases, because it does happen a few times a year. So cable TV put these cases front and center, and every day and every moment, what's happening? Has anyone found little Brenda? So that freaked out parents. There's changes in the news media. There's a really great British sociologist named Frank Furedi who has a book called Paranoid Parenting. He's able to show here's what happened in Britain. Now, Britain didn't have the crime wave that we had. So we had, crazy mass killers. We had all kinds of horrible stuff in the 70s and 80s. There was a huge crime wave. But even still, kids all went out and played. In New York City, kids went out and played. Of course they did. That's what kids have to do. But what Furedi shows is that in the 90s, both in Britain and America, there were so many sex scandals. Some were real, like the Boy Scouts and the Catholic Church. They were organizations that were covering up for these men who were abusing kids. Some were fake, like the daycare sex scandal. Those were all fake. There was nothing going on there. But we freaked out. We didn't trust other adults. And we start feeling like if I ever let my kid out, they're going to be a sitting duck, a target. They'll be abducted. They'll be raped. They'll be, something terrible will happen.
I think that you are underestimating the decrease in the number of kids. So my grandfather was one of 11. Two died in early age. Another one died at age 20. And the other one survived. If you have 11 kids, they entertain each other. So you don't need to have the neighborhood. And when you're down to one or two, that's much more difficult.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. Because it's not just the declining number of kids and the feeling of all our eggs in one basket. It is also a problem of prosperity. As any country gets richer, they care more about quality of life. I remember when I did some of my graduate training, when I was at the University of Chicago, the most intense intellectual square mile in the country. I loved those 2 years at Chicago. I spent 3 months in India. And at the time, there were no seatbelts. No cars had seatbelts. And this was 1993. Because like a seatbelt's going to add a couple bucks to the cost. So then we're not going to do that. But then as you get wealthier, you actually do care about that. And you start caring a lot more about safety. So these are problems of prosperity. So once again, my answer is, we can't just send the kids out and say, go entertain yourselves. We have to be more intentional. And the sociological part, trusting our neighbors, is a damn hard problem.
But what would you propose here if we're not capable, if parents aren't capable of reducing safetyism and embracing risk and community on our own? Would you be in favor of regulation or some form of coercion to make parents do so, given the critical importance of this to our futures? No.
No. As an American, I would not. I was over in the UK a month ago, and in many conversations, the first topic is banning. They're much more comfortable with bans and rules But no, as an American, I would never want the government to do that. But what I do want the government to do, and we talk about this in the book, is to remove things that it's doing that are pressuring people to over-supervise. So one of the worst is that child protective services in every state or city, once they get involved in your life, it's hell. So I started sending my kids out when they were 8 here in New York City, Greenwich Village. It's a very safe neighborhood. We started sending them out to go to the store a few blocks away, go get bagels about 5 or 6 blocks away. Now, in New York City, no one's going to actually call the cops on an 8-year-old kid. But in most of the country, they would, because no one has seen an 8-year-old kid unaccompanied since 1991. Once someone calls the cops, then the cops come, and then they might then say, oh, kid unsupervised, that's neglect. We could turn this over to Child Protective Services. Childhood play is also a collective action problem, or a commons dilemma, because if you're the only one sending your kid out, well, now your kid is kind of at risk because they're the only one, and you might get sent to jail. Some parents have literally been put in jail because they let their kid out. Whereas if you do it as a collective action thing and you all do it, and you go talk to the police department, you say, listen, here's a copy of The Anxious Generation or Free Range Kids. We're going to let our kids out. Is that okay with you? Don't bust us just because. And you can give them a little kid license at letgrow.org, which I founded with Lenore Skenazy. We have a kid license. It says, I'm not lost. My parents know I'm out. If here's their phone number, you can call them. I am hopeful that there will be some private enterprise solutions. I gave a talk in London, and a guy stood up, and he was proposing to create a network of third places. What's a third place for kids? So imagine a place where, there's an adult around, but there's no supervisor, and they can spend hours there, mixed age play, unsupervised. That, I think, would be amazing. So that's worth trying. So, we have to be more intentional to give them independence, but we cannot have our children supervised all the time. Otherwise, when they come to college, guess what? They're not ready for college. And that's what we saw in 2014, 2015. That's why Greg and I wrote The College of the American Mind, because the students coming in 2014, 2015 were so different from those who came in 2012. They were Gen Z, whereas in 2012, they were all millennials.
One of the things you advocate for in your book is a return to some kind of spirituality. Assuming that is a really critical part of childhood, we're going in exactly the opposite direction. We've become more and more secular, although I guess you could argue that we're not secular about things like politics, which have become our new religion. So, but how do we, if spirituality really is an important part of all of this, that almost seems like none of these problems are easy to solve, but that almost seems like the most difficult one to me.
Okay, so first, your listeners are probably like, wait, what the hell? What is this left turns? Haidt is recommending that we all become spiritual. Chapter 8 of the book is titled Spiritual Elevation and Degradation, because I wrote the first 7 chapters about what's happening to kids. The whole book's about what's happening to Gen Z, what's happening to young people. And then I realized, wait, there's so much happening to us grownups as well. We're not untouched by this. And because my first book was The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom, 2006, I read all the wisdom literature I could, East and West, and they tell us things like, be slower to judge, quicker to forgive. Judge not, lest ye be judged. And they tell us, sit still, close your eyes, clear your mind, develop the practice of clearing your mind, because that will open your heart to God or to people. You start living your life online on social media, and it pushes you in exactly the opposite direction. You better judge right now, quick, because if you don't judge, someone is going to judge you for not judging. And apologies, forgiveness, forget it. If you ever apologize online, you're going to be mobbed. So don't apologize. And stillness and silence and meditation. No, you have to keep your AirPods in all the time, because there's so much you have to take in and you have to keep up. Just as I'm a secular Jew. I'm an atheist. I have had spiritual experiences, but I don't believe in God. I'm not a believer. But I am, as a psychologist, I have come to see that when you have strong, trusting relationships and you're not spending all your time trying to impress people, and you are relatively tolerant and forgiving, your life goes better. You're happier, and you're making the world a better place. Look at our politics. Our political life, our democratic life, is basically conducted in the center of the Roman Colosseum. The stands are full. There are millions of people, and they came to see blood. They do not want to see the gladiators kiss and make up. They want to see one chop off the arms and head of the other. And if that's the way our democratic debate is occurring, there's a kind of a predictable direction that our democracy is going to go in, and it's going that way. So yes, I chose the word spirituality, but I wouldn't say like Haidt says we all need to be more spiritual. Rather, Haidt says that the online life, the social media and smartphone life, is pushing us in ways that feel like a kind of spiritual degradation. And so we should all try to reverse that.
When you describe politics today and how social media impact politics, I would like to ask you how social media impacts academia. And what I fear social media doing is exactly the Colosseum. When you talk about the Colosseum, I think about Twitter for academics. You're not really having a community of scholars finding the truth. You are scoring points in a social game. And it might eventually undermine the very role that academy had, because in Jonathan Haidt is a community that decides what is truth, right? And so if we lose this community, we lose the concept of truth. And if we lose the concept of truth, there is no progress in academia.
That's why I'm so alarmed about our universities. I'll just make a controversial point, perhaps. As a few people have observed, if you just look at the political parties, one party is insane. One party, the Republican Party, is not functioning like a normal center-right party. They're tolerating, an attempt to overturn an election and then denying that there was anything wrong. So on the left, people just look at the parties and they say, well, they're the crazy ones. Obviously, the Democrats have two wings. There's a progressive wing and a more moderate wing. And who wins? It's usually the moderates. So the Democrats are not crazy. Well, that's true. But then I talk to my conservative friends and they say, well, maybe it's not as bad as you think, but okay, yeah, there are problems. But you know what? All the institutions are controlled by the left, and they say crazy things, and they're running them into the ground, and they're betraying their mission. Actually, here on a business or economics-oriented podcast, I'll use the word fiduciary duty, a word I've become very fond of since I began teaching business ethics here at NYU Stern. And I think we academics, we have two quasi-fiduciary duties. In our role as teachers, we have a fiduciary duty not to our students' welfare. We're not charged with their welfare, but to their education. We must not do something that interferes in their education. And I would say indoctrination, putting your own politics in, shaming people for being on the right. Most people don't do that. It's not everywhere at all, but it does happen. You talk to conservative students, it happens. That is a violation of fiduciary duty. Anyone who does that, I think, should be expelled or at least disciplined. And then as scholars in research universities or even at teaching schools, as scholars, we have a fiduciary duty to the truth. That is, we must never lie. We must never make up data. We must never twist the statistics to get the result that we want. We have the highest level of care for the truth. That isn't just an individual responsibility, it's a systemic responsibility. And as we have allowed ideology to play a much more powerful role in universities, if you want to yell and scream and shout down speakers, as long as you're on the left doing it for social justice, more power to you, go ahead. That's what we did in 2015, and I think we're paying for it now with the campus protests. So I think the universities did not and professors did not stay true to their fiduciary duties in 2015. That's what the Coddling the American Mind was about. And now we had the fiasco of that hearing in December, where the 3 college presidents couldn't explain why it was wrong to say death to the Jews.
If I may ask one last question, I know we are over time, so I apologize, but you brought up back an issue that I really wanted to ask you, because I agree with you on the fiduciary duty, particularly as a scholar to the truth. I wonder, because when you said about the power of social media, you mentioned the lobbying. But earlier on, you mentioned that Meta is pushing some lines in research. So to what extent, not only we have a problem of ideology in academia, but also a problem of money in academia that really corrupts the research, distort the truth?
No, I think that is certainly true. In medical science, it's a huge problem. Huge amounts of money are spent on doctors and researchers to support them, to give them vacations. And we see the results in the medical field. Now, I've always said, as a social scientist, social psychologist, I've always said, we have corruption in the social sciences, but it's not primarily money. It's primarily politics. It's primarily we spin our results because we're afraid of being criticized if we're not in harmony with the progressive ideas. But I do think that in this case, I think money does play a role. There are some researchers. If anybody who starts an internet institute back in the early 2000s, of course they were funded by the tech industry. Of course they were funded by Meta. So I can't prove that this causes anything, but I think research coming out of internet institutes, I think we have to at least ask that question: is there a conflict of interest here? And so I do think that's part of the issue.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Not Another Politics Podcast. Not Another Politics Podcast provides a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories. It's not told through opinions and anecdotes, but rather through rigorous scholarship, massive data sets, and a deep knowledge of theory. So if you want to understand the political science behind the political headlines, then listen to Not Another Politics Podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. So I thought it was interesting, Luigi. I had thought that there was more controversy about Haidt's argument than he at least was willing to admit.
First of all, in academia, you should never ask a host whether his wine is good, because he's going to tell you that it is good. And this is not my area, so it's hard for me to judge. But overall, I think he's probably right. When you come up with something big like he did, there's always a bit of controversy. Honestly, I think there is also a bit of marketing on the other side. If Jonathan Haidt views become prevalent, this is costing a lot to Facebook, TikTok, and company. And so I'm not surprised that there are the marketing department spinning counter-information and sending everybody articles about why Jonathan Haidt is wrong.
I know. It made me think about some of the other topics we've covered on this podcast. Like, you don't even know when you're reading something where people are coming from, or where some of the studies that people cite are coming from either.
I think it's very important, and something I'm working on is how to make sure that the connections are properly disclosed. I have a new survey showing that people correctly downgrade evidence of people with conflict of interest. And so if you don't disclose this conflict of interest, you, to some extent, create an externality because you downgrade all research. Because if I don't know who is conflicted or not, I ended up not trusting anything.
It is also really tricky as to what constitutes a conflict of interest, because if you're trying to be impartial and you read a piece of research that was funded by Facebook, but you don't know it was funded by Facebook, then you don't really have a conflict of interest. And yet you do, because you relied upon something. And so much of this is second and third and fourth hand, that the end user of the information might not actually have a conflict of interest, but the conflict may go all the way back to something that started the chain. And I actually thought one thing Haidt said in our podcast was really interesting, is that if we can get everybody to agree that this is a problem, then we can start pushing through laws to fix it. And so getting everybody to agree that it's a problem is actually the battleground right now. And I think he's right. I can't think of an ordinary person you could voice his argument to who wouldn't say, of course, that's right. Can you?
No. However, I don't know among psychologists, but certainly about economists, there is almost like an intellectual snobbery of saying, if everybody says something, we must come up with a clever reason why that's not true. Because if we just say what everybody says, to what extent are we expert? We need to sort of say something unconventional and counterintuitive in order to justify how clever we are. In reality, when kids are involved, shouldn't we be a little bit more conservative? Should we wait for the ultimate evidence of harm before we decide that it's not good for kids? This is, there is a cost and benefits, but the cost might be irreversible because you can only be a teenager once in your lifetime. If those years are screwed up, you probably all your life is screwed up. So there is an irreversibility that makes me be very risk averse in these situations.
And we've let social media companies have it exactly the other way around. We've let them define the terms of the battle, that we have to prove to them that it's dangerous before they'll do anything to rein in marketing to children. And it should be exactly the other way around. They should have to prove to us that it's safe. And I guess one reason that it resonates so much for me is that my children were homeschooled for 3 years during the pandemic, and neither of my girls used social media at all. And it was actually once they went back to school that we now have more of a problem with their phones than we did in the past. And you would think it would be exactly the other way around, right? That kids at home would be bored, desperate to connect with their peers on social media, and kids who were going to school would be more comfortable reading or having a play date or whatever it is. And it actually, I think it's a very troubling part of this phenomenon that it does work exactly the other way around, that there is so much peer pressure. And he describes this phenomenon very well, but that there's just so much peer pressure to be on social media. You have to be part of the world as it is.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the fact that you grew up without TV. I did have TV in my house, but my parents prohibited me from watching TV in the evening until I was 14 or 15. And I remember that I felt kind of inferior to my peers because they were all watching the early evening programs, and they were talking at it at school. And I was the only one left out in their conversation, and it was pretty painful.
I guess the places where I break down a little bit with Haidt solutions are in the specifics around when children are allowed access to phones. And again, I think it does come back to this idea that you and I both suffered a little bit because of how we were raised. I still, to this day, am culturally illiterate in the sense that I can't talk about the childhood programs that everybody else watched, whether it's the Brady Bunch, God, what were some of the others? Gilligan's Island? I don't even know. I didn't have a TV, and it leaves me thoroughly out to lunch, even to this date. And social media at its best can encourage kids to connect. And then I think there's the other level of this, the drinking from a fire hose issue. What happens to kids who aren't allowed access to this stuff, who then leave their parents' home or then hit the age where society has decided they're legally able to handle it, and they have absolutely no ability to filter it. I was just sitting behind a kid on the plane on the way home from San Francisco the other week, and the parent took away the child's iPad, I think because it ran out of batteries at the start of the flight. And the kid threw an absolute temper tantrum. And this was a 5 or 6 year old child, the likes of which it was appalling and stunning. But I remember seeing that same reaction with my children. They wouldn't be relaxed and happy after a half an hour on the iPad or an hour on the iPad. They'd be stressed out and frantic and addicted and miserable if you took it away. And I think that's probably an experience that can resonate with every parent, right?
Yes, but I have to say, I took my kids back and forth to Italy many, many times in a world without iPad, and was more painful, I can assure you. I wish I had an iPad to distract them for the 9 hours of the flight.
Oh my God, that's really funny. Yeah, we're all believers in doing the right thing for our children until reality meets, until you meet the reality of a long plane trip, right?
There are a lot of benefits on social media. The concern is when you become the product. And after all, do we want to have a system where our children are the product that is sold? No. But that's what it is when you have social media based on advertising and you use children who are below 18. I thought that actually the Macron's proposal sounded a very interesting one, that you basically ban up to 18 the for-profits social media, the one who do marketing.
I don't know. Did you find Haidt's overall arguments on regulation to be coherent? I guess I did when we were talking, but I'm not quite sure then how we get to the solutions he wants to see proposed. And I liked the idea that with actually the use of social media, that it's regulation that has enabled social media companies to proliferate among our children the way they have. So just take that away. I still am not sure that you can get to the place he wants to go without more government involvement. And that does not seem to be the answer he wants to head toward. What did you think?
I think that taking away the regulation that shields social media companies seems like a no-brainer to me. Also, requiring and enforcing a higher age, and maybe 16, maybe he's 18, to access social media seems also a no-brainer to me. The part that I find it more interesting, and I would like to discuss more, is, remember, is a two-part argument. One is social media, but the other is the fact that our parenting has become too obsessive offline. Maybe it was the result of network TV, but also liability is a big, big issue. And so do you really want to be sued because you neglect your child? No. Ironically, nobody gets sued to let his own child watch porn online, but you are sued if you let them walk the street alone. So I think there is this disconnect between the two worlds. And so maybe one has to decide what we want in terms of the education, because it's not like the government is not interfering with education. The fact that they sue you if you leave somebody alone up to age 12, I was shocked because at age 12, I was traveling by myself all over Italy, basically. And so the fact that you couldn't be left alone until age 12, it sounded like really, really strange in this country. So I think there is a disconnect between the invasiveness of one and the laissez-faire approach in the other.
The removal of that one, we're not going to prosecute parents who let their kids walk to school alone anymore. That would do a little bit, but I think that's chipping away at the margins of this edifice of overprotective and overinvolved parenting that we've created. And I think it involves so many deeper social issues that I don't actually see how that part is fixable. And he wants that to be fixable without any kind of government involvement. And I just don't know that it is. And so I think that whole fundamental question then of how far can the government go in ensuring our kids have a good childhood, does the government even know what that is still an open question.
You're right. I think that a lot of the overparenting is in part due to social pressure, that you feel a shame because, I let my kid at home and my friends think I'm a bad mother or a bad father. I think that there's a lot of that going on. This stuff is not easily changed by regulation. However, regulation often can nudge in this direction. I was reading in Japan, they impose by law that managers should go home at a certain time in the day because there was this race of who was outdoing the other staying at work. And as a result, nobody was going home. And by the way, nobody was having children because you cannot have children while you're at the office, right? And so they decided to nudge the population to actually more have a social life. How do you nudge them? By requiring that the boss goes home early. And then all of a sudden, it becomes more socially acceptable, and that contributes. I don't know the result of this initiative, but I think that that's what Jonathan Haidt has in mind. The change in regulation by itself is not huge, but might be a nudge in the right direction.
Yeah, I think so too. And I can see that at very micro individual levels, how that works. For instance, when I have had teachers in my daughter's classrooms who have said at the very start of the school year, don't you dare as parents get involved in helping them with their homework. This is their time to learn how to do their homework themselves, to succeed or fail at it. And if you're getting involved in doing it for them, I'll be able to tell. But that said, I still think there is this larger, because I see it goes to the very heart of our unequal society, that even at every echelon of society, you have parents who are frantic about their kids getting left behind. And so they overparent and fill all of their kids' days with one educational activity after another from the time they're born until the time they go to college, all out of this desperate fear in today's society where the line between the 0.1% and everybody else is pretty dramatic. And so I don't know how you get hyper anxious parents at every level of the socioeconomic strata to go back to a world in which we don't overparent, given this broader economic backdrop.
I think this is a fantastic connection with the themes of our podcast. On the one hand, the more winner take it all is the economic system, the more you tend to have that pressure. And so one of the advantages of trying to reduce this disproportionate inequality in outcomes is that people get less stress, and so they get less anxious and all the consequences that we're describing.
I was also thinking, and this might be a little bit out there, but I wonder if some of our hyper-aggressive overparenting is also because we live in the age of engineering and of hacks, where everybody wants to believe that if you just have the recipe, you can turn out a perfect human being. And so we're far more willing to meddle or believe far more in our meddling than have the time to do it than previous generations did, who maybe were not so caught up in the idea that everything is solvable and everything can be engineered into a state of perfection. Anyway, that's a little bit out there, but
no, but this is related to what I was saying with Jonathan, is also the number of kids. If you have 5, 6, 8 kids, number one, you don't have the time to do all the stuff. Okay? You don't even have the time. Then, I'm sorry to say, you take more a portfolio approach.
Oh my God, that might be the most economist thing you have ever said, taking a portfolio approach to your children.
And finally, they actually learn a lot from each other, and they kind of, all the stuff that Jonathan was saying happens inside the house. But you have only one child, or you have 2 children and maybe distant in age, etc. It's very hard for them to have these experiences. And then all become more complicated. And also, as a parent, you put all your eggs in one basket, in the one child you have. And so you overinvest in that child. And that child, of course, feels the pressure that comes with it.
Yeah. That's interesting, because then this whole overparenting issue is also tied into this fact that in advanced societies all around the world, people are having fewer and fewer children. And maybe the inevitable result of having fewer and fewer children is that we overparent the ones we do have. And maybe the inevitable result of that is that we have less well-adjusted, less functional children as a result, which is a pretty horrifying chain of causality, which I think goes back to my core issue with Haidt's argument, is that I'm just not sure this piece of it is as easily fixable as he wants to posit in his book that it is. And it does seem to me that if we're going to raise healthy children, both pieces of this have to be fixed. The social media piece has to be fixed, but the other piece has to be fixed too. The real world of play and interaction and real childhood has to be fixed too. And I just don't know how you do that.
Yeah, that's very hard, because the story that he's saying, you let children play in a third-party room with their supervisor, but they don't intervene. I can only imagine if one of those kids get injured, the level of liability. It's like it's inconceivable that something bad doesn't happen to you. So nobody wants to be in that business. Maybe what we should do is make it easier for people to play in the street. I was in Brooklyn last weekend, and it was beautiful to see that they block certain streets, and they turn those streets into playgrounds.
Really?
They had block parties, and they had like a little soccer field. Now, I already felt the pain of the kids falling on the cement, but that's a different story. But again, about overprotecting, you learn that they had even a small swimming pool, or the one like inflatable, and they connected with the hydrant, and they had a small swimming pool. Of course, this is all outside of regulation. Kids can get sort of killed in the swimming pool, but I think that that's the kind of activities that he was describing, and we should have more of.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Lita Cesarine, with production assistance from Utsav Gandhi, Sebastian Burka, and Brooke Fox.